First contact and misconceptions. The Galactic Concord had encountered many species in its long history, some warlike, some peaceful, but none had ever truly disturbed them. When the first reports of humanity came through, the consensus was unanimous. Another primitive species, one with an unusual affinity for violence, but ultimately too small, too disorganized, and too emotional to be a true threat. Captain Valrex of the Xel'nari species was the appointed overseer for humanity's introduction to the galactic community. His people were a proud warrior race, valuing honor, discipline, and the structured nature of battle. To them, war was a ritual, a noble affair where armies clashed under strict rules, with honor dictating every engagement. The humans, by all accounts, had a long history of conflict, but their wars were viewed as inefficient, chaotic, and bound to outdated philosophies. It was amusing, really. Some species in the Concord saw humanity's brutality as savage, while others dismissed it as the antics of a species too primitive to understand the art of war. None of them realized the truth. The transport landed on an Earth military base, a sprawling complex teeming with armored vehicles, aircraft, and rows of soldiers training in synchronized drills. Valrex's security detail kept close, their golden ceremonial armor gleaming in the sun. To them, this was an exercise in formality. The humans would be introduced to the Concord's way of war and gradually assimilated into a more civilized approach to combat. Valrex was led into a meeting hall where several high-ranking human officers waited, along with a select group of elite soldiers. Among them was Sergeant David McAllister, a decorated Marine who had been assigned as a liaison for the Xel'nari captain's visit. As the discussions moved forward, it became clear that humanity had a deep respect for military strategy. Their training was rigorous, their tactics well-honed. Still, Valrex couldn't help but find it crude. Their philosophy lacked elegance, relying on sheer force and unpredictability rather than the refined codes of battle his people adhered to. During a break, Mac and Valrex found themselves alone, standing by an observation deck overlooking a group of soldiers running drills. "You fight well for such a young species," Valrex admitted. "But your wars, they seem excessive." Mac smirked. "Excessive? How do you mean?" Valrex's eyes narrowed. "You strike not just warriors, but supply chains, infrastructure, entire civilizations. War is meant to be a test of honor between two forces, not a campaign of destruction." Mac chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, that's not how we do things." He leaned against the railing. "You see, we don't fight wars for sport, Captain. We fight to win." There was something in his tone that unsettled Valrex. A cold certainty. "I have studied your history," the alien said, "and I find it strange that even among yourselves, you have rules that dictate battle. Your so-called war crimes, a curious concept. Some of the things you forbid are standard practice among many species." Mac's expression darkened. "Yeah, that's because those things are too much, even for us." Valrex frowned. "Explain." Mac sighed. "All right, let's say we're fighting an enemy. We can't just drop nerve gas on their cities. We can't wipe out an entire species just because we're losing. We don't execute prisoners or use civilians as shields." He glanced at Valrex. "Those are war crimes. We have rules because when we don't have rules, things get real nasty, real fast." Valrex tilted his head. "You restrain yourselves?" Mac let out a hollow laugh. "Buddy, we have to. Because if we ever went all out, we'd become something even we're afraid of." The words lingered in the air, unsettling in their quiet finality. For the first time in his career, Valrex felt something strange, a prickling unease at the back of his mind. Humans had to ban certain methods of war, not out of mercy, but because even they feared what they were capable of. And that terrified him more than anything. The rules of war and the horror of humanity. Valrex had fought in dozens of conflicts across the stars, had bested warriors from formidable species, and had led countless campaigns under the strict warrior code of the Xel'nari. But the conversation with Sergeant McAllister left him unsettled. "We don't fight wars for sport. We fight to win." Those words echoed in his mind as he sat in the human military strategy room, surrounded by Earth's finest commanders. Their methods were strange, their philosophies unnerving. War was supposed to be about honor, two sides meeting in a fair contest of strength. And yet, the humans approached battle with the cold, ruthless efficiency of a predator. As the meeting continued, an officer brought up a holographic display. It showed a simulated battlefield, a vast desert war zone where two forces clashed. The human commanders debated various strategies, pointing out weak spots, discussing supply line disruptions, and planning ambush tactics. Valrex cleared his throat. Your focus on logistics is impressive, but your tactics lack the honor of direct engagement. One of the officers, a grizzled general with piercing blue eyes, turned to face him. Honor doesn't win wars, Captain. You don't fight to impress your enemies. You fight to make sure they never stand up again. A murmur of agreement went around the room. Valrex couldn't help but recoil slightly. Surely there must be some limits. Mac leaned forward, his expression unreadable. Oh, we have limits, all right. We call them war crimes. That phrase again. Valrex frowned. This concept confuses me. You claim to limit yourselves, yet your wars are known to be among the most devastating in the galaxy. Mac sighed and pulled up a new set of files on the holographic display. All right, let's break it down. The first image showed a ruined cityscape, crumbling buildings, smoke rising in thick columns, bodies strewn in the rubble. The caption read, Battle of Stalingrad, 1942. This was one of our bloodiest battles. Civilians were trapped in the crossfire. Both sides were relentless, fighting street by street, house by house. Mac's expression darkened. By the end, over 1 million people were dead. Valrex remained silent. He had seen war-torn planets, but there was something disturbing about the sheer scale of destruction presented so casually. Mac continued. Now, some things are illegal in warfare. Targeting civilians on purpose? Bad. Using chemical or biological weapons? Really bad. Torturing prisoners? That's a no-go. Valrex raised a brow. And yet, you're known for overwhelming force. What is to stop your people from ignoring these rules? Mac's lips curled into a smirk, but there was no humor in his eyes. Oh, we break them sometimes. And when we do, it's not pretty. He pulled up another image. My Line Massacre, 1968. A grainy black and white photo of soldiers and civilians filled the screen. These guys broke the rules. They murdered unarmed civilians. They weren't just enemies. They were farmers, women, children. When the world found out, the soldiers responsible were put on trial. Some were imprisoned, others executed. Valrex's mandibles clicked together in thought. So, your people police yourselves? To an extent, Mac admitted. We hold ourselves back because we have to. If we didn't, we'd become monsters. Valrex crossed his arms. And what happens when the enemy does not follow these rules of yours? Mac's smile faded. He tapped the display again. Dresden firebombing, 1945. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 1945. Images of firestorms and mushroom clouds filled the room. Valrex's throat tightened. What am I looking at? Mac's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a species that had spent millennia perfecting war. This is what happens when we stop holding back. The room was silent. Even the hardened human officers sat in grim stillness. Valrex could no longer ignore the truth that gnawed at the edges of his mind. The humans did have rules, but those rules weren't a show of mercy. They were a warning. The thin line between restraint and annihilation. Valrex had spent the night in restless contemplation. He had traveled across the galaxy, engaged in countless wars, but nothing prepared him for what he had learned about human warfare. The idea of war crimes perplexed him, not because of the concept itself, but because of what it implied. Humans, despite their fragile physiology, had the power to annihilate entire civilizations. And yet, they restrained themselves. Why? The next morning, he found himself seated across from Sergeant McAllister once again, this time in a dimly lit war history archive deep within the military base. McAllister, or Mac, as his comrades called him, was drinking coffee, another one of humanity's baffling but effective stimulants. You've been quiet since yesterday, Mac observed, taking a sip. Valrex's mandibles twitched. I've been thinking. You say humans have rules, yet you also claim that those rules exist because of what happens when you discard them. I need to understand. What is the difference between your rules and your wrath? Mac set his mug down, the ceramic clinking softly against the metal table. You ever hear the phrase, total war? Valrex shook his head. Mac tapped on a nearby console, and a holographic screen came alive. World War II, the Pacific Theater. The display shifted through historical footage. Planes diving, bombs dropping, cities burning. The sheer scale of destruction was staggering. Back then, we had a saying, if you make us fight for every inch, we'll take miles in return. The enemy didn't surrender easily. They fought to the last man. Civilians, too. We saw it on island after island, places like Saipan and Okinawa. The screen changed again, now showing kamikaze pilots crashing their planes into human battleships. Thousands of soldiers fought and died, refusing to surrender. So, Mac continued, his voice grim, we realized something. If we had to invade their homeworld, it would cost millions of lives. Not just ours, but theirs too. So we dropped these. The display showed a black and white image of a mushroom cloud rising over a ruined city. Hiroshima, Nagasaki. Valrex's breath caught in his throat. Your people destroyed entire cities to stop a war? Mac nodded. They surrendered. Not because we fought them in the fields, but because we showed them what would happen if we stopped caring about the rules. Valrex exhaled slowly. He had always believed war was a contest, a battle of skill, strength, and honor. But humans didn't see war as a game. They didn't fight for sport. They fought to end wars. He gestured to the screen. And if your enemies refuse to surrender? Mac leaned back in his chair. Then we do what we must. The screen flickered again, shifting to a modern battlefield. A distant war fought on a desert planet. Human soldiers moved with terrifying precision, using drones, orbital strikes, and overwhelming force. Every engagement was calculated, every action efficient. You wanted to know the difference between our rules and our wrath. Mac asked. Valrex nodded. Mac's expression darkened. Our rules exist to keep us from turning into the very monsters we fight. But if you back us into a corner, if you make us throw those rules away. He paused, then leaned forward, his voice low and cold. Then we don't stop. We erase you. Valrex sat in silence. He finally understood. Humanity was not afraid of war. They were afraid of themselves. A lesson etched in fire. Valrex had always believed that war was a test of strength, a way for civilizations to prove their worth. But now, as he walked alongside Sergeant McAllister through the human military compound, he understood the terrifying truth. Humans didn't see war as a proving ground. They saw it as a necessary evil. The more he learned, the more uneasy he became. The records of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had shaken him. But what truly unsettled him was how methodically humans had refined their ability to wage destruction since then. It wasn't just about weapons. It was about strategy, logistics, and, most disturbingly, psychology. Humans didn't just win wars. They made their enemies lose the will to fight. McAllister led him to an underground training facility where young recruits were sparring in hand-to-hand combat. The air smelled of sweat and effort. The sound of fists hitting training dummies echoed through the chamber. These are your warriors? Valrex asked. They looked young, inexperienced. They're learning, McAllister replied. But war isn't just about what you can do with your fists or your rifles. It's about breaking the enemy's mind. He gestured toward a side room, where a separate group of recruits sat in front of screens, engaged in simulations. Some were running battlefield tactics. Others were speaking to holographic representations of enemy officers, learning how to manipulate negotiations, how to seed fear. You fight with words? Valrex asked, astonished. McAllister smirked. Sometimes. If we can win a war before the first shot is fired, that's the best-case scenario. But when we do fight, he nodded toward the sparring recruits. We make sure we fight to end it. Valrex had seen enough. He turned to McAllister, his reptilian eyes narrowing. What if a species refuses to surrender? What if they meet you with the same savagery? McAllister exhaled, rubbing his jaw. That's when we stop holding back. With a few swipes on his wrist console, McAllister pulled up another historical record. Operation Desert Storm. The Battle of Fallujah. The Tet Offensive. Images filled the screen, burning cities, precision airstrikes, entire divisions wiped out in the span of hours. One after another, human wars had escalated until there was nothing left of their enemies but ruins and regret. Then, the final file appeared. One Valrex did not recognize. The PYRRYX extermination. The footage was chilling. The PYRRYX had been a race of conquerors, their fleets darkening entire skies. They had taken human colonies, slaughtered civilians. In response, humanity had wiped them from existence. Their planets were gone, their history erased. Valrex's breath was heavy. He finally spoke. You call it war, but what I see is extinction. McAllister didn't deny it. Instead, he studied Valrex carefully. You want to understand why we have rules? This is why. We restrain ourselves not for our enemy's sake, but for our own. Valrex realized then that humans weren't just warriors. They were something else entirely. They were predators who had chosen to chain themselves for the good of the galaxy. But if that chain ever broke, the galaxy wouldn't survive. You said, construct Chapter 1 with 700 words and clear, focused narrative. ChatGPT said, Chapter 1, The Illusion of Harmlessness. The Galactic Concord had long categorized species into tiers of military capability. The Aztari, with their planet-destroying dreadnoughts, were Tier 1. The brutal insectoid Trask, capable of overwhelming worlds with sheer numbers, ranked Tier 2. Humans, on the other hand, were labeled Tier 6, barely above primitive warlords. It was a classification that Valrex, supreme tactician of the X,